Today's agenda will be our introduction, webinar instructions, training session with Julia, Q&A, and next steps. And today's focus for our training webinar will be on 1099s. And our training session is with Julia Nikishina today. She specializes in bookkeeping and tax consulting for small businesses, specializing in unique and complex accounting needs of interior designers, and she is based in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. As always, during the webinar, feel free to submit your questions in the control panel box, and we'd be happy to answer as many questions that we can get to at the end of the training. Hi, Julia. How are you?
Hi, Sarah. How are you?
I'm doing fine, thank you. Let me switch this over to your screen so we can get this started.
Perfect.
All right, I see your screen.
Great, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So today's focus will be prepping for end of the year, which is very, very quickly approaching. And we're going to discuss sending 1099s, who should they be sent to, when they need to be sent, and going through the settings in Studio to ensure that you're capturing the information correctly. So for those of you who may not be familiar, 1099s are sent to anyone who provides any type of service to you. It could be in the form of an individual or a company. The IRS has very specific guidelines as to who receives 1099s. So if a company is a C corporation, they would not be eligible to receive 1099s. Anyone who's a sole proprietor, an LLC, or a partnership would receive a 1099. S corporations are also not eligible for 1099s. Obviously, that could be very, very confusing. And the only way you know if a company is eligible or is not eligible, you would, before you do business with anyone, before you write anyone a type of check, you would send them a W-9 form, which you could access very, very easily on Google. We recommend that you keep this downloaded on your desktop. And before you do business with a company or an individual, you send this form to them. So this form would gather all of that information for you. It would tell you if they're a DBA, if they're doing business as, what their EIN is, or what their social security number is. And then right here, section 3, what type of entity they are. And this really allows you to determine who should receive a 1099 or who should not. It's critical that you try to do this before you give somebody a payment. Obviously, it's a really good incentive for them to say, you know, I'm sorry, I can't process this payment to you until I receive the W-9 back. A lot of bigger firms also at the same time, when they request a W-9, also request a certificate of insurance. Because if you're working with construction or any type of large buildings, especially in bigger cities, you do need that insurance certificate anyway. So it's just a really great system and habit to be in. So once you get this W-9 back, and let's pretend we're going to have a new vendor. So once you get this W-9 back, you would go into Studio, filter by your vendor, and let's assume that we got this from AA Custom Furniture. So AA Custom Furniture, here they are, they're a vendor. Here's all their information. If you go to codes, you'll see right here, there's a section that says 1099 and federal ID. What I like to do to know that I received a W-9 from someone is, even if they send me their W-9 back and they are not eligible, so let's say they're an S corporation or they're a C corporation, I would go in to their vendor ID and I would mark this as a no, and then I would put in their EIN. So this is a great double check for myself that if I'm ever, especially as the years go by and you're doing a lot of business, I'm able to look in here to say, oh my gosh, if I have their EIN, that must mean I communicated with them in some way and they gave it to me. So I know that the no in here and the EIN in here is a great indicator for me. That's something that just works well for us. Then everybody again is on the same page. So as a reminder, you send a W-9 form to everyone. Typically, of course, you would not send it to any type of retail or box vendor. You're obviously not sending this to Pottery Barn. For Pottery Barn, you're going in, you're doing point and click, you're putting something in the shopping cart, you're checking out. They're also providing you goods and not services for the most part. Sometimes it could be a combination of goods and services. Pottery Barn example is actually a great example. The Pottery Barn would not receive a W-9, and they would not receive a 1099. You would not send them a W-9. They're giving you a product, and 1099s are only sent out for services. So again, typically, and you could look this up as well, but professional fees, laborers. The only other type of vendor who doesn't fall into this service category is actually your landlord. So if you make rent payments to anyone, your landlord should give you a W-9. You are required to submit information to the government about rental payments that you make. So also, as just so you're familiar, the reason that the IRS requires 1099s, and they actually just increased penalties, I believe it was this year, they just announced that the penalties per 1099 not sent did go up. So it's a way that they actually audit their records, and they're able to track different individuals and different companies to ensure they're reporting the proper amount of income. So if everyone, back in our example, if there's all these people using AA Custom Furniture, and AA Custom Furniture receives 1099s, and the government gets a copy of that 1099, and it equals $1 million, but then AA Custom Furniture files a tax return that equals $750,000, there's obviously a disconnect, and the IRS would be able to say, okay, this is obviously cause for concern, and they would go in and audit AA Custom Furniture. So that's the reason they require it. That's the reason they do say that there's always penalties with not sending one. The penalties are per individual, not sent one, or per company. So just be mindful, be in the practice. Like I said, always request a W-9. Make sure that your vendors are up to date in Studio. Again, so when we went to projects, I always go to miscellaneous addresses, went to vendors. Here's my edit screen, and under codes. So here's the most important part, right? Are they eligible? And what is their EIN or social security number? You could also store their W-9. We do that a lot, just so for reference. We would set up a folder under your images and attachments and call it W-9s. That way all of that information lives within Studio as well. So next, go into reports and put your 1099 in the search box. So before you are able to send, so at this point in time, we have all our W-9s from all of our vendors. We know the information in Studio, and the vendor ID is accurate. You would send 1099s by their due date, which is the end of January, unless the IRS decides to extend it. Obviously, given COVID, they have been changing some deadlines. You want to send 1099s only after you have completely reconciled, especially your cash accounts. So when you send 1099s, you are only sending them based on the dollar value paid in cash. Anything processed on a credit card, those merchant processors send their own 1099s. So just like when you sign up with Payrock or Stripe, you're required to give your company information and your EIN, because then Stripe will send you a dollar value of transactions that you process, because that's revenue to you. So credit card payments are not part of your 1099 reporting. They should be excluded. But reconciling your cash is critical, because if you put into your ledger, and actually, why don't we put one in for AA Custom Furniture? So if you put into your ledger that you paid AA Custom Furniture, 6 payments, 5 payments of $1,000, but they didn't cash half of them, or you accidentally duplicated checks, or you forgot and you didn't void it, that then translates to the total amount paid to them. So it's really, really important that the information you're putting in and the information you're reporting on a 1099, remember, it goes to the federal government, matches. Okay, we're just going to throw this in here. That it matches and it ties out to everything on your bank statement. So You would reconcile all the way through December 2021. You would make sure that anything outstanding in your check register too isn't obviously too old, for example. If you know that a vendor, for example, from December didn't cash a check, but it's January, let's say 5th. So that would be okay. But if you have a check that's outstanding from January, February of 2021, do your due diligence. You could reach out to that vendor. I would void that payment. I would make sure that the amount you're reporting on your 1099 is accurate. Because what could happen is if a vendor decides to dispute the information that you're showing, we would have to actually amend it. And we would do that. And we have done that for clients just over the years for lots of different reasons. But then you have to go in and you have to file an amended 1099. You have to send them an amended 1099. I think it was in here. Oh, perfect. And that's just more time and money on your end. So make sure that everything's reconciled. Look at your outstanding transactions. Make sure that they're within a reasonable amount of time. And then go in and start pulling your information. So Studio's done a great job of making sure you're able to access the payments to your 1099 recipients. Again, this is only going to pull. So let's look at one. And so the legacy reports should be the old reports from desktop. Oops. And we could talk about the different reports that are in here. Oh, here's our dandy payment. As another reminder, the minimum amount required to report 1099s is $600. So anything paid under $600, you are not required to submit a 1099. The IRS only wants to capture information over $600. Going back to the first point of collecting W-9s, you may not know what you're going to pay a vendor. So again, good rule of thumb, good practice is always send a W-9 anyway. If you reach the threshold, you send them a 1099. If you don't, that's okay. You now have their W-9 on file. Studio, so these happen to be these happen to be more than $600, but Studio at the moment doesn't have a way to filter off if there are payments made to 1099 vendors that are less than $600. So you could at that point in time go in and change those vendor IDs. So like Joe Johnson is one, right? So we would go into here, we would go into our miscellaneous addresses. Though I don't know if I see him. Oh, here he is. And I would have to manually change him to a no. And look, we don't even have his EA. We don't even have his social. I always think too, sometimes it depends on that dollar value. If somebody's at $590, there is no harm in sending an extra 1099. Actually, the vendors, I think, sometimes get irritated with it. But there is no real negative downside. So if you don't feel like, if you have a ton of vendors at the end of the year that you paid $300 to, and technically they should all receive one, you would have to go in and make all of these a manual no. And then remember to go back in and make these all a manual yes, because you want to make sure that you're capturing that information for next year. So actually, let's pick another vendor so we could see an example. First Dibs is everybody's always first vendor. How about ABC Stone? We're going to assume they installed something for us. But nothing would ever cost under $600. Stone repair. It can get really tricky too. So if you have vendors, especially somebody like a custom upholsterer, but though they typically wouldn't be reselling fabric. But if you do have any type of construction, like laborer who is providing you materials and labor, and they split their invoices, like they show you the bill to say, for example, materials were X and labor was Y, that may be a vendor that does push back on you to say, you gave me a 1099 for the total, even though it should just be the labor portion. We're going to say outside services again, because we're not doing this through POs. $300 on Citizens Bank. Save and close. Oh, Let's go back under addresses, stone, codes. Yes. None to me is always a really good red flag. It's just a great reminder to say, okay, well, I'd never selected anything. I need to go in and change it. So again, try to be in the habit of always putting yes or no. It'll just help in the long run. So save. Website is an invalid format. Oh, go to Studio. Let's see what it picks up. So do you see how it is on here for $300? There is no way to filter it off. Again, remember, you are not legally required until it hits $600 and exactly $600. And at that point, you'd have to send your 1099. So you would have to go in, make ABC Stone a no, and then remember to go back in and immediately make it a yes. Okay, let's look at some of the other reports. So there is a report in here that tells you right from the bat that this report you could filter by date range, and it's only picking up amounts paid to vendors through your cash account. So it excludes your credit card. So if you go into these filters, vendor 1099 is yes, and the account cash is yes. So if you have multiple cash accounts, and as long as they are set up correctly, so the cash checkbox, we go to chart of accounts, and we go to here, is right here. So you are required, well, you should be required. You should know that if you have a cash account set up, this box needs to be selected, and that'll populate under this report. I also like to put no too, or even leave it blank. Oh, maybe the blank won't work. Let's see, 2021, 12/31. Again, we're assuming that it is the end of the year. So what this tells me actually it is really interesting. So there's only one person right now in the vendor and all of the IDs, and it's Jasper Showroom, that's set up with a no. So anyone who's set up with a none didn't get filtered on this report. I like to review the no's just as much as I like to review the yeses, because I think it's important for me to understand who I paid, how much I paid, did I forget a W-9? Shoot, should they have received a 1099? What if a company sold? For example, too, like what if you know somebody changed ownership, and then that means you don't know what type of new entity they are. So all of that is really important. So again, I like to review both the yeses and the nos. Pulling this one back up again. Look, I paid myself. Here are our dollar values. So remember, so this report that says excludes credit cards, if you want to go into your reports and favorite it, that'll be really, really helpful. Start out by reviewing, well, we talked about the cash, but go back into your miscellaneous addresses and review your setup. The other report I think would be helpful actually to review before you even get to going to the 1099 reports is your cash disbursements. And it's really for the same reason that I want to be able to see who I paid. And again, did I miss anyone? Because heaven forbid that you did. So it does give you the detailed transactions too, but then it does tell you the dates. So this is a really great place to start too, to say, oh shoot, was there somebody in here that I should have received a W-9 for? It's a great check. This is a really good time of year. Well, if you're not somebody who's been in the practice of getting W-9s throughout the year, at least try to start, I would say now, November, December, even January, before the deadline, because it's the worst position to be in, making calls January 20th, asking for all of this information. So pull this report, get an idea of who you've paid, how much you've paid, did they meet the threshold, and then start reaching out to vendors if you need to. Miscellaneous gas, parking, rent. That gives you a really, really great idea. So just keep in mind, as of last year, I'm getting my years confused, but as of last year, the IRS now has newer forms of 1099s available. So let's go back into our reports. Let's go back into all and look for 1099s. So starting when the filing was due for 2020, so January 2021, you are now required to file 1099 NECs, non-employee compensation forms, and 1099 miscellaneous forms. Different vendors receive different types of forms. Why they decided to make it more complicated, I personally don't know. Rents and anyone paid for like legal fees and attorney fees go on your 1099 miscellaneous form. If you remember, and for those of you who've been doing this a long time, the 1099 miscellaneous form had different boxes. And if you were to pay rent, they went in a different box. They didn't go into box 7 for non-employee compensation. And attorney fees went into a different box as well. So perhaps they're actually trying to simplify the process to say, okay, anyone, and this does help, right? Non-employee compensation. So anyone who is not an employee and who is receiving compensation for a service now gets a 1099 NEC. Remember, before you file these, and I'm sure Studio will communicate this as end of the year approaches, the formatting may change. Make sure you, and there's different types of forms that you can buy if you decide to buy the printable forms. Like if you go, and say 1099 printable forms, not the 2020 ones. There's different types of formats that you can buy. So for example, that if they get mailed to you, and then you decide to print on them. So make sure, do some sample test prints, just like you would do when you print your checks. Print one out, hold it up to the light, see if it lines up. There's also a lot of different websites that can file them electronically for you. So this one's a really popular one. It's actually very, very reasonable. It's fairly easy. What you would do if you are deciding not to print your own forms is you would go back into this report. You would then filter by your totals. So you'd want to be able to know how much you paid to each vendor. You'd then have the necessary information. You need to make sure that you have their EIN and obviously their address, and all of these types of services can even file them electronically for you. So as long as you have the total and all of the actual vendor information, you're able to set up an account and file them electronically. It has been really easy. I know last year the mail was a disaster. So so this type of company will send them electronically or mail them on your behalf. And then obviously if you need a copy, you could always send a copy digitally after the fact. But it did make the process a little bit easier. I know we tried really hard to make sure we emailed everyone possible, just because the mail was so unreliable last year. So that's definitely a thought to consider as well. Again, remember to reconcile first, then wait for Studio in terms of communication regarding that the forms have been updated. As you know, the government is always changing, even if they're moving like the margins around or the boxes around. So before you start printing miscellaneous forms or the NEC forms, remember to either reach out to Studio or Studio will reach out to you and let you know that everything's ready to go. There is no way at the moment in Studio to differentiate between who's receiving a 1099 NEC versus who's receiving a 1099 MIS. So if you have a rent vendor in here, which I don't know if we do, you would still go into that vendor ID. And make sure that they're selected as yes, and then with their EIN. But then it would be up to you when you go into 1099 MIS to select the vendor ID that you paid your rent to, and only send a miscellaneous form to that type of vendor. So just keep that in mind. Also, do your own due diligence or ask a tax professional. Make sure if you have any type of questions that you're reaching out to the appropriate parties for sure, just to make sure that you're sending the right form to the right type of vendor. We personally, this is the company that we wound up using, I think actually for the last couple of years. They've worked really well. I know, and they've actually been really user-friendly too. So if you are still printing your forms, it depends on obviously how many you have, but consider using some type of option like this. Especially if you're somebody, if you want to get it done early and let's say the forms aren't yet available. I haven't seen anything in terms of any type of new forms coming out from the IRS, but of course you never know what surprises they have. So at the moment, I think that covers all of the basic information. I know that there's a lot of different scenarios regarding who receives them and who doesn't. And again, just do your best for sure. That's what we say to everybody. Cover your butt too. If you're not sure, I always say send one. Honestly, if somebody's not getting back to you and you paid them throughout the year and you didn't get a W-9 and now they're not getting back to you, I'd rather be safe than sorry, especially with the increased penalties. I always think it's like sales tax, right? They'll penalize you for underpaying, but they'll certainly never give it back to you. Well, they'll certainly never penalize you for overpaying. Okay. Keep an eye out too on any communication regarding any type of new reports that are coming out. Like I said, the forms before you go in and print. Remember to reconcile, remember to check all the disbursements that you've made throughout the year. And I think at this point, I'll just open it up to questions. I'm going to start back with the oldest question first. So somebody asked, did you include payments made through Venmo or PayPal? PayPal definitely sends their own 1099s. Venmo, actually, I don't know. I'm not a big fan of Venmo personally. I just find it's not my preferred method for any type of business, really. But that is something that Venmo would be able to tell you, and that's something you should ask them. So Sandy has a great question. We pay some vendors via check and credit card. Since we are to exclude credit cards from the NEC, how do we address? So again, remember this report in here. So as long as your chart of accounts are set up, and as long as everything again is reconciled and posted correctly in your ledger, if you run this report that's only capturing disbursements out of your cash accounts, you will be able to see all of that. So Diana also has a great question. If a vendor does not separate labor and product, is it okay to send for the full amount? My answer to that is always yes. Yes. Again, I'd rather send a 1099 versus not sending one. In QuickBooks, for example, you used to be able to, and I'm sure actually you still can, you could filter 1099s by accounts. So even if you paid a vendor a lump dollar value, but you split up their payments into different types of accounts, you could decide which expense account received a 1099. At the moment, we don't have that option in Studio, and you would then have to send it on the full dollar value. That particular vendor that you're sending it to should not have any issue with that, right? Their gross revenue, their gross revenue obviously is important, but then if there was any type of materials, they should have picked that up on their own cost of goods sold. So there definitely can be an explanation to that vendor if somebody pushes back, but really there's nothing else that you can do, and you are required to send one. So someone asked, could you clarify by what you mean by not sending a 1099 if paid by credit card? So when you use your Visa, MasterCard, or American Express, those vendors that are set up to take those payments filled out their own applications with those companies, and they gave them their EINs, their entity types, their all of that all of their company information. So the credit card companies are required to send their own 1099s. So our 1099s would not include anything paid via credit card. It would only include payments paid via cash. So that's the reason this report, again, if it does stay in here, excludes credit cards. That's why this report was created, to make sure that you're only capturing payments made out of your cash accounts. I still have an issue in past years in Studio that an inactive vendor will not show up on the 1099 reports. Is that still an issue? Is there a way around it? That's actually a great question, and I don't know offhand, but we could certainly test it out. I guess I would ask why you would have inactive vendors that have disbursements throughout a year. If, for example, you're merging IDs, you would then make an inactive vendor once. So who did we just pay? Actually, we should have these reports up. So if you merge vendor IDs, and then you could make one of the vendors inactive, but then there won't be any payments associated with it. That is actually why, one of the reasons why that button is created. So Joe's bookkeeping. So he is on here. So let's go into, Joe. Let's make him inactive. Vendor 1099, vendor ID. So this is still pulling up Joe. Let's just double check that we did make him inactive. Yeah, because there he is inactive. And he is still showing up on this report because he did receive a cash disbursement. So hopefully that answers your question. You should also, just like a lot of times when I run project worksheets, I exclude inactive client IDs. You should also be able to just make sure that you're pulling all payments made. Also think about that disbursement report, same thing. Like I would just make sure that all disbursements are regardless of if the vendor is inactive or active, and then just line that up with all of your EINs and make sure your address IDs are active. So that's a secondary double check, I think, as well. I'm actually going to go back in and make Joe active again. How do you send a 1099 if you don't have their EIN? So again, best practice is to receive their W-9. To try your best, try to be in the habit of asking for it before you make any cash disbursements. But even now, again, you're trying to close out a year, definitely follow up with vendors to say, hey, I'm trying to close out a year. Can you please submit this form to me? You can submit 1099s with a blank EIN or a social. You will wind up getting a notice back from the IRS that says the information you submitted on the government form doesn't match their internal IRS records. And that makes sense, right? Because they have that information on file. They have a name and an EIN in their system, and you're only sending them a name. So not all the fields are lining up on their end, and they're just letting you know. So I would always actually encourage you to send one blank. It's better than not sending one at all. But really try, phone calls are really the last resort, but definitely try your hardest to obtain that information. So someone asked, would we be able to run a 1099 report and it be accurate if we haven't final invoiced? So yes, so the 1099 reports, so this transaction report is pulling from your cash disbursements, which is why we had also, again, gone into the reports and the cash disbursements. So it has nothing to, invoicing is a different part of the accounting process. It's obviously still very, very important, and it'll capture revenue and cost of goods sold, but cash disbursements are different. So as long as your cash disbursements are up to date and your reconciliations are up to date, you can definitely still file 1099s. You shouldn't close out your year without doing your final invoicing, and you shouldn't file your tax returns without doing your final invoicing. But you can send your 1099s. Oh, yes, Robert, we did that as well last year. So this report, hold on. So this report, especially as long as it's all filled out, we export it into Excel, and then import it into Track 1099. If you only have a couple, again, it may not make the best use of your time. But for those of our clients who had 50, 100, but who had multiple 1099s, we're definitely exporting as much as we can and importing it. I would imagine all the softwares do that too, not just the one that we happen to pick. But it was definitely a great time saver. Helen, this is a really great question. Does it matter if we pay our rent to an individual or a company? So no, it does not. The IRS is just asking for any type of rental payments. So they could be both to an individual or a company, just like a 1099 NEC now is for individuals or companies. The government just wants to know how much money those individuals or companies are getting paid. So remember that the rents do go on 1099 miscellaneous form. Make sure you have somebody's social security number. They should be aware of that. Individuals can fill out W-9s just as much as companies can. I mean, that's why there's a spot on here for social security numbers. So that's all information that you can capture for sure. So Annie has a great question. Can you suggest reports in chronological order? So everybody's going to do things a little bit differently. I personally always prefer to, so first step really would be, remember to make sure that everything is reconciled on your cash side. Obviously your credit card should be reconciled as well, but for 1099s, all of your cash accounts need to be reconciled. If you have 5, don't just reconcile one and then go, okay, let me go print 1099s. Because what if you accidentally entered 50 manual checks into one of the other cash accounts and they have payments to vendors that wound up never receiving them? So definitely make sure all of your cash accounts are reconciled. I, again, personally like to start out with this disbursement report. We actually pull it for a lot of different reasons, but I like to review this report first to have an idea, of who I paid throughout the year. And I review this, one by one, really make sure. I'm trying to look at the vendors more or less, and obviously the totals, but really go through my vendors to say, okay, do I know that, again, I've caught Adobe's on here. I don't need a W-9 from Adobe or Amazon or obviously American Express, but who do I need one from, and do I have it? So, and if you received one 15 years ago, maybe it's time you get an updated one. Obviously, use your judgment. The IRS does, I don't remember which form this one is. It was just revised. They don't revise it actually too often, but they do revise it, from time to time. So that's sometimes a really good sort of prompt for all of us to say, oh shoot, I know they just revised it. Maybe I'll request some new ones. It just depends on your relationship too, I think, with some vendors.
Sorry to interrupt you, Juliet. Sarah here. I just want to remind everyone that's on the call, please get your questions answered. If you have any for Julia, send them in the question box and go to webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. So review cash disbursements, right? We have one up. Make sure that everything is reconciled. So first reconcile, make sure that any older, use judgment, but any older transactions have been voided and you're not capturing those payments to vendors, because that means that you're going to be picking up additional revenue to that vendor who didn't receive it, obviously, and that's not accurate either. So reconcile first, then review cash disbursements to see who you should have a W-9 from. Make sure at that point you go into your miscellaneous addresses. We've been picking on poor Joe here. Show active. And go through them to try as much as you can to make sure that they're a yes or no and their EIN. Again, my personal preference is, even if you have their W-9 and they do not receive a 1099, take the extra 15 seconds, put in no, and put in their EIN. That way you're very clear to know, okay, I know I have their information, I got it on file. From that point, go back into your reports, go to all reports. I just always like to have the 1099 in the search box, that way you know what options are available to you. I like to pull this report, so excludes credit card payments. It's going to give it to me by date range. Again, we're assuming that we're in some point in January in 2022. And I did vendor 1099, yes. The other thing I mentioned earlier in the call is review your no's too, because what if there is a mistake and you recognize it right away and you're like, oh shoot, this person really should be a yes. So review your no's. If they need to be changed, go in and change them, and then go in and review your yeses. Remember, 1099s for both NEC and miscellaneous are $600 and above. So if anyone is in here under $600, so this ABC Stone is an example, you should go in and make their vendor ID for 1099s a no. You have to do this manually. So Studio at the moment doesn't have a way to filter this off for right now. And so if you have a lot of these, definitely you should go in to do that, make them all no's, then rerun this report. But remember who you did that to, and then go in and make them a yes. And then at this point is when you would decide, are you printing them? Or are you using some type of online service? So if you're printing them, here are your templates. This is the new NEC form. This is the miscellaneous form. Remember, Studio will send some kind of correspondence just to let you know that the forms are buttoned up and ready to go. We also want to make sure the IRS forms are still what they are, what they were last year. Margins may change. So be in the habit of, just like when you print checks, just to do a test run, print one out, make sure everything aligns. There are different types of forms available. So the NECs that I know I used last year only had one per page. I believe we were looking earlier today, there were some that had 3 per page. Let's see, these print out, I believe, 2 per page. So before you print anything, especially if you're buying the forms, don't waste them. They could get pricey for depending on how many you need to file. So line them up first. And you will need to manually determine, so unless you decide to print them one by one. So if half of your vendors are getting, let's say you paid a lot in attorney fees and your landlord, and if you have 4 of those and 4 miscellaneous, you are going to have to play with either the yes, no settings or print them individually in terms of making sure that the appropriate vendor receives the appropriate type of 1099 now. Somebody else had asked if you can send a 1099 with a blank EIN. Again, you can. The IRS will notify you at some point throughout the following year, so in 2022, that your records do not align with theirs. And it's basically because when you sent the 1099 form, the vendor ID that goes through the IRS system is tied to an EIN or a social on their end, and then your form doesn't have that. So they're going to let you know that something was not aligned. And again, you could use that opportunity to go back to the vendor to say, I got a notification from the IRS. Please provide me your W-9 and your incorporation status. Do your best. I wouldn't go crazy for sure, but definitely do your own due diligence. Try to get as much information from the vendors as possible. Yes, so someone's asking the difference between NECs and miscellaneous forms. Remember, this is new. I would imagine last year there was probably confusion, and maybe not necessarily for the IRS, but there was confusion in how these should be filed and for who. So Google's your friend. If you don't have a tax professional, always reach out to somebody and ask them. But for the most part, like in a nutshell, 1099 miscellaneous are no longer used for non-employee compensation. So for those of you who remember, box 7 said payments made to anybody that isn't an employee, but that is used for like service and or labor. So miscellaneous forms now, though, sorry, that's probably confusing, but the miscellaneous forms now are really only in this industry. There's a couple different nuances, but in our industry, the miscellaneous form would be used to anyone who you sent rent payments to. So any type of landlord that you may have, and any attorney that you worked with, like any type of legal fees, those go on 1099 miscellaneous forms. Anybody else who you paid, again, non-employee compensation to, but anyone who's in the labor category, anyone who's providing a professional service. I know Studio and like their chart of accounts, you have outside services, anyone who's doing any type of consulting. Those are all services provided, and vendors and companies that you're paying. So anyone like that would go into this NEC form. So a lot of times too, if we get a new client and we're working with them to understand, do you have W-9s? Do you not? What does your 1099 list look like? We'll look through the categories too. So that to me can be telling. So you could do cash disbursements, but then you could also even just pull your general ledger, and you could do it through your cost of goods sold, right? You could do it through any of your administrative expenses and just really look through to see who you're paying. So for me, that's important because I want to make sure that, right, if I'm new to you, I don't know the vendors necessarily all the time. So if I just want to concentrate on outside services to make sure that this particular client has W-9s from the right people, I could pull a report like this to say, okay, I see this is who you paid. Do you have W-9s from these people? Again, cash disbursements works just as well if you're familiar with the type of vendor. And if I'm not, this is a good workaround for me. But I'm sorry, I don't know if that question. So, but by all means, reach out to a tax professional. I know, we're constantly looking things up to see if any types of rules or regulations changed. They like to keep us on our toes. So all the 1099 reports. But remember, so with this new rule, the 1099 NEC and the 1099 miscellaneous FAD, you will have to decide on your own, and especially if you're printing them, about which vendor to select and who would get which form. So that's super important as well. Are there any other, oh, you're welcome. Are there any other questions? Sandy has. So in addition to asking for a completed W-9, ask for the IRS WEIN letter. This is what the IRS uses the name given to the company by the IRS to avoid kickbacks. Yes, I mean we've seen that too, where so somebody, for example, may have a DBA, or let's say you're off by a letter or something like that. I mean, I've never asked for that, but if you're saying that's something that works for you, I mean, I think that's and people aren't giving you pushback, I think that's certainly a great recommendation. They should know on the W-9, right, to give you all of the necessary information. I mean, that's why it has box 1 and box 2, but that's certainly a really great suggestion. So at this time, if there are no other questions, I would continue just to make sure that you are looking out for information for close of year from Studio. They're constantly feeding you information in terms of like what's been changing. Keep a lookout for anything related to the 1099s. Remember, they are super important. We'll let you know for sure when the forms are ready to go. I assume that the 2021 IRS forms will be available as soon as, they actually may be available now. I just don't know, but we'll let you know for sure. And look into these types of websites. This isn't the only one. There's definitely a lot of them out there. So they make it really, really easy as well.
All right. Thank you so much, Julia. Great information today. I'm going to switch gears here back over to my slide and share Julia's contact information with everybody. Give me just a second to do that. All right. All right. Thank you so much again, Julia. To reach Julia directly, her email can be found here, julia@newagefinancialconsulting.com, and phone 215-622-0281. And she has a fabulous website, newagefinancialconsulting.com. And as always, you can reach out to Studio Designer Support for questions, support@studiodesigner.com. You can chat with support Monday through Friday, and you can schedule a non-billable 15-minute call. All right, thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.